My name is Megan Day, and I'm a student at Sequoia High School. My school code is 1360. This is my individual oral commentary. This passage is an excerpt from Macbeth by William Shakespeare. In the excerpt by William Shakespeare, Macbeth struggles with his sanity and the distinction between fiction and reality. The text was written by William Shakespeare in 1606. The text was written after a group of English Catholics attempted to blow up the English Parliament on November 5th of 1605. This act would later be known as the Gunpowder Plot. The text was intended for James I, a surviving victim of the Gunpowder Plot. It was written to appeal to his interests of treason and witchcraft. This excerpt is a soliloquy. Macbeth is contemplating the distinction of imagination and reality. The author describes an imaginary dagger floating in front of Macbeth. At the end of the excerpt, a bell rings, signaling for Macbeth that it is time for him to kill Duncan. Shakespeare conveys that the act of destruction towards another, motivated by greed and power, results in self-destruction, apparent through insanity. A feature I observe is juxtaposition, conveying the distinction between imagination and reality as a result of self-destruction. Macbeth states, quote, "I have thee not and see thee," and comments on his, quote, "oppressed brain." Shakespeare writes about the dagger before Macbeth. Here we see the difference between imagination and reality. By utilizing juxtaposition and imagination and reality, we see the great effects of self-destruction. When harming others, we are harming ourselves in more ways than just one. Macbeth describes his emotions when stating that, quote, "nature seems dead," and comments on its, quote, "wicked dreams." The corruption of nature is directly related to the corruption of Macbeth's thoughts. As Macbeth will create self-inflicted wounds, he will also lose his perspective on innocence. Dreams are juxtaposed by wickedness, the wickedness representing the emotional state of Macbeth. Lastly, Macbeth comments on his, quote, "cold breath." Breath is generally warm and a representation of life. The juxtaposition and symbolism represents the great destruction Macbeth faces for himself when the act of killing takes place. Killing Duncan. Self-destruction is literal, when cold breath usually symbolizes death, when warm breath symbolizes life. By killing, his self-inflicting his own wounds. A second feature and pattern I observe is the repetition of the senses. Shakespeare writes, "Let me clutch thee," in reference to the imaginary dagger hanging before his eyes, taunting him. When Shakespeare writes the word clutch, it is both literal and figurative. Macbeth wishes to take hold on reality by clutching the dagger. Macbeth begins to see the effect that murder will have on him, and not just necessarily on the victim of Duncan. The usage of the senses is the best representation of the confusion between imagination and reality that Macbeth is contemplating. Symbolically, Macbeth cannot clutch the future because it has not happened yet, but despite this, he lacks the feeling of stability. So even though Macbeth hasn't officially killed Duncan, he's still unstable, and this can be inferred that he is almost positive with the decision that he is about to go and commit murder. I found another moment of repetition of the senses when Macbeth says, quote, "Hear not my steps, hear it not, Duncan." Macbeth cannot hear and make sense of his actions. Here we see that Macbeth has a sense of panic before this quotation, but after this quotation takes place, we see a shift in his characterization, and Macbeth displays confidence through his tone and connotation of the words. This building confidence shows his motivation being extreme greed and power. Shakespeare employs the repetition of senses again when Macbeth says that, quote, "Mine eyes are made of the fools on the other senses." In this quotation here, Macbeth comments directly on the effects of his instability to tell which senses are real and which aren't. So Macbeth is struggling with what exactly is he seeing that's real, what exactly is he hearing that's real, and what is in his head, because this image of this dagger is staggering to him, and it's his focus of this whole excerpt. However, he's ignoring all the other senses, and the fact that this dagger is not actually there is confusing him. His eyes are, quote, fools, and he is confused by his feelings with overwhelming emotion. The tone as we read this shows the shifting confidence from panic to a calm, almost as if Macbeth has gone into this extreme trance. And the sight of the dagger makes him focus even more on the kill. I also noticed the motif of violence to portray both the act of destruction towards another and one's self-destruction. I noticed that when Shakespeare writes about, quote, fatal vision and the dagger of the mind, that this act of destruction is extremely apparent. These words connote the repetition of violence. This violence is a reflection on the concept that by causing suffering in another, one causes their own emotional suffering as well, and this suffering is self-inflicted. The fatal vision is a negative, violent result of Macbeth's actions that will affect himself directly, while in contrast, the dagger is the object that will inflict this terror. It's almost as if the dagger that he's trying to grab is going to symbolically stab himself with. I found another moment of motif of violence when Macbeth describes that, quote, only the blade, the dungeon, or on the blade and dungeon, gouts of blood. The blade symbolically represents the actions of the kill, while the dungeon represents the possible result of Macbeth's actions. So here we see the past and the present come together. The motif of violence shows the gruesome side of Macbeth's actions that will lead to his self-inflicted wounds of destruction. The violence also relates to his thoughts and the future internal struggle that he will always have. Shakespeare employs, again, the repetition of violence when he writes, quote, it is the bloody business. The bloody business that he speaks of is what will later affect his self-destruction, his destruction to another, as well as his self-destruction. His greed takes over him when this bloody business becomes more attainable to him. This repeated usage of violence, in other words, shows the change in his personality. The option of power overtakes Macbeth and changes his personality and changes ultimately what he is capable of. In the excerpt by William Shakespeare about Macbeth's struggle to maintain stability, the objective of power and greed are present. This passage shows a shift in Macbeth's personality and in his capabilities as a character. This passage shows me that that people will go to great lengths to achieve power and greatness, and it shows this greed that's associated with high power. This passage showed me that hurting others can do great damage to ourselves as well, and our conscience is extremely powerful. Overall, Shakespeare conveys that the act of destruction towards another, motivated by greed and power, results in self-destruction, apparent through insanity.